Director Phillips refused to evacuate 200 kids as flames closed in, pushed my phone away. When I showed him the alert and said, "I'm not ruining this camp's reputation over a maybe," I stayed silent. That was 11 months ago. This morning, his widow called me in tears after reading his journals. Did you ever have to choose between keeping your job and doing the right thing? I'd been a camp counselor for 5 summers, but I'd never seen the sky turn that sick orange color before noon. The forest fire was supposedly 20 miles away, but the ash was already falling like snow, and my group of 12-year-olds kept asking why the sun looked bloody through the smoke. I ran to the main office where Director Phillips was on a conference call with the camp's board of directors, and through his window, I could see him pointing at financial charts while the Forest Service evacuation alert blared on his radio. When he finally hung up, I told him we needed to get the kids out now because the wind was pushing the fire straight toward us. Phillips stood up and put his hand on my shoulder like I was one of the campers having a panic attack. "Ryan, I've run this camp for 15 years, and we've never evacuated for a fire that was 20 miles away, and I'm not starting now when we have parents paying $4,000 a week for their kids to be here." I tried to show him the emergency alert on my phone that said, "Evacuate immediately," but he literally pushed my phone away. He said if I mentioned the fire to any of the kids or tried to scare them, I'd be fired on the spot, and he'd make sure I never worked with children again. By lunch, the smoke was so thick that kids were coughing during outdoor activities, and I could hear the younger ones crying in their cabins because their eyes were burning. I found 3 other counselors in the dining hall, and we all agreed this was insane, but Phillips had the van keys locked in his office, and the camp buses needed special keys that only he and the drivers had. That's when we saw the actual flames on the ridge above the camp, maybe 2 miles away, and moving fast with the wind pushing it straight down the valley toward us. I sprinted back to Phillips's office and found him on another call, this time with parents, assuring them that the media was exaggerating and their children were completely safe. When he hung up, I pointed at the burning ridge and said we had maybe an hour before those flames hit camp. He slammed his hand on his desk and screamed, "You're just a college kid who doesn't understand liability and reputation, and if you cause a panic that gets a child hurt during an unnecessary evacuation, their parents will sue us into bankruptcy." The power went out right then because the fire had hit the power lines, and Phillips still insisted it was just a precaution by the power company. That's when I knew I had to do something to protect these kids, because clearly he wasn't going to. I remembered that the maintenance shed had a spare set of bus keys hidden behind the tool cabinet because the janitor told me about it last summer. I ran through the smoke that was now so thick I could barely see the trail, and my lungs felt like they were full of campfire. The keys were right where Greg said, and I sprinted to the bus parking area where another counselor was already trying to break into one with a rock. I held up the keys and said, "We're getting everyone out right now," and she actually started crying with relief. We drove the buses right up to the cabins and started loading kids, and I'll never forget this 8-year-old camper asking me if we were going to die while Ash covered his Spider-Man backpack. Other counselors started helping once they saw what we were doing, and we managed to get all 200 kids loaded in about 15 minutes of absolute chaos. Phillips came running out of his office screaming that we were all fired and he was calling the police to arrest us for kidnapping, but my coworker just looked at him and said, "Dude, look behind you." The entire ridge was on fire, and you could hear trees exploding from the heat. We drove those buses down the mountain road going way too fast, but the fire was literally racing us down the hillside, jumping from tree to tree like something out of a disaster movie. In my rearview mirror, I saw Phillips running back to his office, and I figured he was going for his car, but later we found out he went back for the camp's financial records and 100-year-old photographs that he kept in his fireproof safe that turned out not to be fireproof enough. The last we saw him, he was dragging boxes of documents toward his car when the propane tank behind the kitchen exploded, and the whole admin building went up in flames with him still inside. We made it to the evacuation center at the high school, and I started doing head count while kids were crying and counselors were calling parents. I counted once and got 197, which couldn't be right, so I counted again and got the same number. Another counselor and I compared our lists, going through every single name, and that's when my stomach dropped through the floor. 3 kids from the older boys' cabin weren't on any bus, and nobody remembered seeing them during evacuation. Somewhere in that burning camp were 3 kids who trusted me to keep them safe. I thought I'd save the campers when really I'd left 3 to die. My hands were still shaking when this black Mercedes screeched into the high school parking lot, and Linda Morrison jumped out before it even stopped moving. She ran straight at me in her designer heels, and when I told her Jake wasn't on any of the buses, she grabbed my shirt with both hands and started shaking me. "You killed my son!" she kept screaming while other parents pulled her off me, and I just stood there knowing she was probably right. The fire chief found me 20 minutes later sitting on the curb and pulled me aside to tell me the camp was completely gone. Nothing left but ash and twisted metal beams where buildings used to be. He said search and rescue couldn't go in until tomorrow at the earliest because the fire was still burning in spots and trees were still falling. I made it to the gym bathroom just in time to throw up everything in my stomach, thinking about Jake and Ethan and Marcus trapped in those flames. That night, I was sitting in my car trying to breathe through the guilt when Sarah knocked on my window and climbed into the passenger seat. She told me she'd seen the 3 boys sneaking toward the old mining trail during lunch, way before we knew about the evacuation, and that trail led to the abandoned copper mines that went all through the mountain. If they'd gone exploring in there, they might have found shelter from the fire, might still be alive somewhere in those tunnels. I couldn't sleep that night, just kept seeing Ethan's inhaler sitting on his nightstand and Marcus's ADHD medication schedule taped to his bunk, all the little details I should have remembered during evacuation. Their parents had trusted us to keep them safe, and I was the one who decided to evacuate without doing a final cabin check because I thought we didn't have time. The next morning, I went to the search and rescue command post they'd set up in the school cafeteria, but the coordinator told me I couldn't join the search because I wasn't certified and didn't have proper gear. I knew those trails better than anyone after 5 summers at that camp, so I drove to the sporting goods store and bought hiking boots and a headlamp with my last $100. The back road that circled toward the mines was blocked off with evacuation barriers, but I just drove around them and kept going until fallen trees blocked the road completely. The smoke was still thick enough that every breath burned my already damaged lungs, but I hiked 2 miles up the trail until I found the mine entrance Jake had talked about during campfire stories last week. There were footprints in the ash leading right into the tunnel, fresh enough that they had to be from after the fire started, and my heart started pounding because maybe they really were alive. I found a Snickers wrapper just inside the entrance, the same kind Marcus always had in his backpack, and I started calling their names as I followed the main tunnel with my phone flashlight. 20 minutes into the mine, my light caught something blue on the ground, and when I picked it up, my stomach dropped because it was Ethan's inhaler, completely empty. The tunnel split 3 ways ahead, and I had no idea which path they'd taken, so I picked the middle one and kept calling until my voice cracked. I searched for 2 hours before my phone battery died, and I had to feel my way back out in complete darkness, scraping my hands on the rough walls. Back at the evacuation center that evening, parents were screaming at each other about lawsuits while their kids sat in corners with 1,000-yard stares. I heard 2 board members in the hallway talking about how to handle the Phillips situation and whether the camp's insurance would cover what they called gross negligence resulting in death. The next morning, Greg found me in the parking lot, and I could smell the whiskey on him from 3 feet away when he told me he'd seen the boys that morning too. They'd asked him for flashlights because they wanted to explore the mines, and he'd given them 2, but made them promise to be back by lunch. He kept saying it was his fault too, that he should have told someone, should have stopped them, and I didn't know what to say because we were both right. Sarah found me later with a stack of old geological surveys she'd gotten from the town library, and we spread them out on the hood of my car to map the mine system. The mines connected to natural caves that might have protected the boys from smoke, but she pointed out that some of the shafts flooded during heavy rain, and there'd been a storm 2 days before the fire started. The water could have pushed them deeper into the mountain if they went in there to escape the smoke. I folded up the maps and headed back to the evacuation center, where parents were still arriving to pick up their kids. 3 days had passed since the fire, and Linda Morrison was standing by the entrance with a man in a suit who looked like a lawyer. There's something odd about how Director Phillips kept talking about money and lawsuits while kids were literally choking on smoke. I wonder what kind of financial pressure he was really under to risk everyone's safety like that. She saw me coming and pointed right at me while talking to him. The lawyer walked over and handed me an envelope while Linda stood behind him with her arms crossed. The papers inside said I was being sued for depraved indifference because my unauthorized evacuation resulted in the deaths of 3 minors. Other parents were watching from their cars, and I could feel their eyes on me as I read through the legal terms I didn't understand. Linda stepped closer and told me she'd hired her own search teams since I'd obviously failed to save her son. The lawyer said I should get representation immediately because this was just the beginning. My hands were shaking as I walked to my car and called my college roommate Mike, who was in law school. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I explained everything that had happened. Mike went quiet for a long time before telling me I needed a lawyer right away, but good ones cost thousands of dollars. He said the camp's insurance would probably cover me, but when I called them, they said coverage was denied for counselors who acted outside their authorized duties. I was completely on my own with no money for legal help. The next morning, I couldn't sleep, so I went to the library and started researching mine rescue procedures on their old computers. I found a 1987 newspaper article about 2 kids who survived 3 days in the same mine system during a flash flood. They'd followed underground streams to a cave system with natural ventilation and made it out alive. The boys might have done the same thing if they knew about the caves. My phone rang, and it was a fire investigator asking me to come to the sheriff's office for an interview. I drove over, and he questioned me for 3 hours about everything that happened with Phillips before the fire. I told him about the evacuation orders Phillips ignored and how he locked the van keys in his office. I explained how he threatened to fire anyone who tried to evacuate the kids. The investigator took notes on everything and showed me photos of the burned camp. He pointed to one photo of Phillips's office and said they found his remains there with boxes of financial records around him. The safe he thought was fireproof had melted, and all the documents were destroyed. On day 5, my parents drove up from Denver after seeing the news coverage about the lawsuit. Mom hugged me in the motel parking lot and begged me to come home with them. She said I was destroying myself with guilt over something that wasn't my fault. Dad said the professionals would find the boys, and I needed to take care of myself. I couldn't leave, though, because those kids trusted me to keep them safe. I told my parents I was staying until we found them one way or another. Mom started crying, and Dad just shook his head, but they got a room at the same motel to stay with me. The next morning, the search coordinator called with news that changed everything. Search and rescue had found Marcus's backpack at a mine intersection 300 yards from the entrance. Inside was his ADH medication and a water bottle that was still half full. His phone was there too, but the battery was completely dead. The coordinator said this proved the boys went deep into the mine system and they were expanding the search area. He said finding the backpack meant the boys made it past the smoke and into the tunnels. Sarah called all the other counselors, and we met at a coffee shop to plan our own search. We knew things about the boys that search and rescue didn't know. Jake always went uphill when he got lost at camp because he thought higher ground was safer. Ethan stayed near water because he was scared of dehydration after a heat stroke incident last summer. Marcus followed walls when he was confused because his therapist taught him that technique. We created our own search grid for areas the official teams hadn't covered yet. Each counselor took a section based on what we knew about how the boys thought. On day 6, I woke up before dawn and drove to what was left of the camp. The parking lot still had painted lines for the buses, but everything else was black and destroyed. The dining hall was just a metal skeleton against the dark sky. I sat on a concrete barrier and watched the sun come up through the smoke that still hung in the air. I found a melted piece of the camp sign in the ashes and picked it up. The plastic was warped into something unrecognizable, but I could still see part of the pine tree logo. This place where I'd spent 5 summers was gone forever because one man cared more about money than children's lives. Day 7 brought the first real hope we'd had all week. A volunteer search team found fresh scratches on a mine wall that looked like someone marking their path. The marks led toward an old ventilation shaft that connected to the cave system I'd read about. The scratches were at kid height and seemed deliberate, like someone was trying not to get lost. The rescue coordinator said they were sending their best team into that section immediately. That same afternoon, the state fire marshal held a press conference about the investigation. He announced that Phillips would be posthumously charged with negligent homicide if the boys were found dead. The camp board immediately released a statement saying they had no knowledge of Phillips's refusal to evacuate. They claimed he acted alone against their policies, but I knew that was garbage because he'd been on the phone with them when I first told him about the fire. That night, I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about those 3 kids somewhere in the burning mountains. So I drove around the evacuation zone until dawn, checking every place teenagers might hide. Day 8 started with me parked outside the old copper mine entrance at 3 in the morning, just sitting there in my car trying to think like a scared 14-year-old who'd gotten separated from the group during chaos. The mine had been closed since the 70s, but kids always dared each other to go inside during camp activities, and I remembered Jake bragging about how far he'd explored last summer. I must have dozed off because Greg woke me up by knocking on my window around 7, and he had this look on his face like he'd just remembered something important. He told me the boys had been talking 2 weeks ago about finding old mining equipment in a shaft near the creek, somewhere the regular search teams wouldn't know about because it wasn't on any official maps. We grabbed flashlights from his truck and hiked through the burned forest where everything was still smoking and the ground was hot through our shoes. Greg led me to this spot covered by thick bushes that the search and rescue teams had walked right past, and when we pushed through, there was a narrow opening in the rock that you'd never see unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the beam from my flashlight caught footprints in the thick dust, 3 sets heading deeper into the mountain, and my heart started pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. We followed those prints for what felt like forever, maybe an hour of walking through tunnels that kept getting smaller until we had to duck and then eventually crawl on our hands and knees. That's when we heard it, this faint tapping sound, rhythmic, like someone was hitting metal on rock in a pattern. Greg and I looked at each other and started tapping back on the tunnel wall, and we heard a response immediately. 3 quick taps, then 2 slow ones. We crawled faster toward the sound, scraping our knees raw on the rocky floor, following the tapping through passages so narrow my shoulders barely fit. The tunnel opened into a bigger chamber where part of the ceiling had collapsed, creating this small air pocket, and there they were, all 3 boys huddled together in the beam of our flashlights. Ethan was wheezing bad without his inhaler. Marcus had his legs stretched out at a weird angle, and Jake was holding a piece of metal pipe he'd been using to tap. They'd been drinking water that was dripping from the rocks into little pools, and Jake had kept them calm by telling stories about rescue teams finding lost hikers, making up details to keep their spirits up. The rescue took 6 hours because we had to wait for the professional team to widen some passages and get Marcus out without making his ankle worse. When we finally emerged into daylight, Linda was there with the other parents, and she collapsed to her knees sobbing when she saw Jake, holding him so tight I thought she might never let go. She looked at me over his shoulder and mouthed, "Thank you," before the ambulances took them away, and I thought that was the end of the nightmare. The next day, I sat in the hospital waiting room for 8 hours, but they wouldn't let me see the boys because their parents had lawyers there taking statements. A detective pulled me aside and told me I was being investigated for child endangerment, something about how I should have done a proper head count before leaving camp, and how my unauthorized evacuation created the chaos that separated the boys from the group. The relief I'd felt finding them alive turned into this sick feeling when I realized the legal nightmare was just starting. The camp's insurance company sent 3 investigators who spent the next week interviewing every counselor who'd been there, focusing on my decision to break into the bus without authorization. They kept suggesting I'd caused unnecessary panic that could have led to injuries during the evacuation, asking the same questions over and over like they were trying to get someone to change their story. Sarah came to my apartment on day 12 looking exhausted, and she told me the investigators had offered her immunity from any lawsuits if she'd testify that I pressured the other counselors to evacuate against Phillips's direct orders. She was applying to law school, and any legal trouble would destroy her chances, but she was torn between protecting herself and telling the truth about how Phillips had ignored every fire warning. Phillips trying to save his money papers while the whole camp burned down around him? That's like fixing your hair in the mirror while your house falls apart. Talk about having your priorities completely backwards and paying the ultimate price for it. I drove back to where we'd found the boys and sat there thinking about how they'd survived by doing exactly what we'd taught them during wilderness training. Marcus had used his tendency to hyper-focus on details to map the tunnel system in his head. Ethan's careful nature had helped them ration the energy bars in Jake's backpack, and Jake had kept everyone's morale up with his natural leadership. 2 weeks after the fire, the state fire investigator released his report showing that Phillips had been warned about inadequate evacuation procedures in 3 previous inspections. The report said he'd claimed the camp's location in a valley made it naturally fireproof, and now the board members who'd backed him during those phone calls were claiming they'd been misled about the safety protocols. Linda called me 3 days later and asked me to meet her at the coffee shop on Main Street, saying she had something important to discuss about Jake's situation. I walked in and found her sitting in the back corner booth wearing sunglasses even though it was cloudy, and when I sat down, she pushed a folded check across the table toward me. I opened it and saw $50,000 written out to me, and before I could say anything, she leaned forward and told me this was for me to disappear and never speak about what happened at the camp again. She said her husband was running for state senate, and the scandal of Jake being left behind during the evacuation would destroy his political career, and they needed this whole thing to go away quietly. I pushed the check back across the table and told her I couldn't take money to cover up what happened, and her whole face changed like someone had flipped a switch. She stood up and said if I didn't take the deal, she'd make sure I was destroyed in court and would never work with children again in my life. Her husband owned the local newspaper and 3 TV stations, and she said they could control exactly how this story got told to the public. She picked up the check and tore it in half, then dropped the pieces on the table and walked out, leaving me sitting there with my hands shaking. 2 days later, I ran into Greg at the gas station and barely recognized him because he looked like he'd aged 10 years and smelled like he'd been drinking since breakfast. He grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, saying he needed to tell me something that had been eating him alive since the fire. He said he knew Director was wrong about not evacuating, but didn't speak up because Director threatened to fire him if he supported my concerns about the fire danger. Greg had worked at that camp for 20 years, and it was the only job he'd ever had, and now he felt responsible for every single kid who'd been in danger because he chose his paycheck over their safety. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely light his cigarette, and he kept saying he should have backed me up when I tried to get the kids out sooner. I was packing up my apartment a couple days later because I couldn't afford rent without a job when I found my counselor training manual shoved in a box with other camp stuff. I started flipping through it and found Director's handwritten notes all over the margins about maintaining parental confidence and protecting camp reputation above everything else. One note said, "Scared parents don't pay," next to the section about emergency procedures, and another said, "Perception matters more than reality," next to the safety protocols. I realized he'd been training us from day one to put money and reputation ahead of the kids' actual safety, and we'd all just accepted it as normal camp operations. The state opened a formal investigation the next week into the camp's safety violations, and their preliminary findings were worse than anyone expected. They found Director had been falsifying evacuation drill reports for the past 10 years, claiming they'd done monthly drills when they'd only done 2 per summer. He'd also been pocketing money that was supposed to go toward emergency equipment like fire extinguishers and first aid supplies, using it instead for his personal expenses. The board members all claimed they had no idea about any of this, even though they'd signed off on every single budget and safety report he'd submitted. Then, the district attorney's office called and said they were charging me with 3 counts of child endangerment for leaving Jake, Ethan, and Marcus behind during the evacuation. My court-appointed lawyer met with me and said they were offering a plea deal where I'd admit guilt, take 2 years probation, and agree never to discuss the case publicly again. If I fought the charges and lost at trial, I was looking at 5 years in prison, and she said with the Morrison family's influence in town, fighting it would be nearly impossible. I was sitting in my car trying to decide what to do when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Jake using a burner phone, and he said his parents were making him lie about what happened in the mines and wanted him to say he didn't remember how they got there. He'd recorded his dad coaching him on exactly what to say to make it sound like the whole thing was just confusion during the evacuation, not that they'd been forgotten. His dad kept saying they needed to protect the family's reputation and that telling the truth would hurt his campaign and make them all look bad. Jake said he felt sick about lying, but his parents said if he didn't cooperate, they'd send him to military school out of state. I met with Ethan's parents 2 days later at their apartment, and his mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, while his dad kept thanking me for saving their son. They said they wanted to help me fight the charges, but they couldn't get involved publicly because they were undocumented, and any contact with the legal system could get them deported. Ethan's mom pressed a small metal pendant into my hand, a St. Christopher charm, and whispered it was for protection during my troubles. They both had tears in their eyes when they said they'd be praying for me every day, but that was all they could do without risking their whole family's future in this country. Sarah called me that night and said she'd decided to tell the truth no matter what it cost her personally. She gave a deposition to the state investigators, saying Director had refused to evacuate and threatened to fire anyone who tried to get the kids out early. Within hours, the camp's lawyers started attacking her credibility, digging up a minor drug charge from her freshman year of college and using it to paint her as unreliable. They leaked the information to Linda's husband's newspaper, and the next day, there was a front-page story calling Sarah a troubled former counselor with a history of drug use. Marcus's foster parents reached out through my lawyer saying they wanted to help, but had no money for legal fees or expert witnesses. Marcus had been drawing incredibly detailed maps of the mine tunnels, showing exactly how the 3 boys survived, using his perfect memory to mark every turn and chamber they'd hidden in. His foster mom said his autism had saved their lives because he'd memorized the whole mine system from a book he'd read years ago, but the camp had always labeled him a behavioral problem because he didn't follow social rules the way other kids did. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman said she'd been a counselor at the camp in 2018. She told me Phillips had done this before during a smaller fire threat 3 years ago, and she had emails showing 3 board members were in the room when he refused to evacuate despite warnings. She forwarded me 12 emails where Phillips called evacuation orders government overreach, and the board members agreed that protecting their reputation mattered more than theoretical danger. I printed everything and brought it to my lawyer, who said this changed everything. But 2 days later, the local news ran a segment calling me the rogue counselor who traumatized 200 children with an illegal evacuation. Linda sat there on camera saying I acted without authority and created chaos that endangered kids more than any fire would have. The reporter never mentioned Phillips refusing to evacuate or the fact that the whole camp burned down 20 minutes after we left. Every restaurant and store in Pine suddenly wasn't hiring when I walked in with applications, and the EMT training program sent a rejection letter citing pending legal matters even though I'd passed all their tests. My bank account dropped below $2,000, and my parents were already borrowing money to help with legal fees they couldn't afford. I was sitting in the library trying to figure out how to pay rent when Jake walked in, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, and sat down across from me. He pulled out his phone and played a recording of his dad telling him exactly what to say about me abandoning them and how to make it sound believable in court. Jake's hands were shaking as he told me he'd been having nightmares every night about being in that mine, while Phillips kept telling parents everything was safe. He said he wanted to tell the truth, but his parents had already signed papers with their lawyer saying he'd testify against me. The next day, I got served with new papers because the camp board was suing me for defamation after I'd told the fire investigator about Phillips refusing to evacuate. They claimed I was making up stories to avoid taking responsibility for abandoning 3 children during the chaotic evacuation I'd started without permission. My lawyer said fighting both cases would cost at least $50,000 I didn't have. 5 days later, at my arraignment, the courtroom was packed with parents and media when Jake suddenly stood up in the gallery and shouted that I'd saved his life. Security grabbed him while his parents tried to pull him back down, but he kept yelling that I was a hero and Phillips was the one who almost killed them all. Director Phillips wrote, "Scared parents don't pay," right there in the training manual. Makes me wonder if every camp decision was about money from the start. Jake recording his dad coaching him to lie is interesting. Seems like everyone's got their own truth they want told here. The judge banged his gavel warning about courtroom disruption, but the damage was done because every reporter in the room had recorded Jake's outburst. That night, his face was all over the local news, with the headline asking if the star witness was being coached to lie. Sarah called me the next morning saying she'd been digging through camp documents and found something huge about their insurance policies. The camp had one policy covering acts of God like fires and another covering human error, but the second one specifically excluded gross negligence. Phillips refusing to evacuate meant neither policy would pay out, and the board members would be personally liable for millions in damages. She'd already sent copies to 3 reporters who were suddenly very interested in the real story. Greg showed up at my apartment 2 days later, looking clearer than I'd seen him in years because he'd stopped drinking after the fire. He remembered Phillips had a breakfast meeting with major donors the morning of the fire where he promised their kids would get an authentic wilderness experience no matter what. Greg had been fixing the conference room door and heard Phillips tell them that a little smoke would build character and teach kids resilience. He still had the work order in his truck, showing he was in that room at that exact time, and he'd kept the donor list Phillips had dropped. I spent the next 2 days in the library finding 17 similar cases where camps ignored evacuation orders, and in every single one, the directors faced criminal charges. A lawyer from Denver called saying she'd take my case for free because her nephew died at a camp in Wyoming that refused to evacuate during a flood. She said the pattern was always the same, with camps putting money over safety until kids died or almost died. 2 days later, the fire investigator released his final report stating Phillips's refusal to evacuate directly contributed to endangering 200 children, and his death was a result of prioritizing property over human life. The board immediately released a statement claiming Phillips had deceived them about the fire's proximity, even though Sarah had already given reporters text messages showing they knew exactly how close it was and told him to keep the camp open. The next morning, Linda's husband stood on the courthouse steps with 20 reporters pointing cameras at him while he announced his run for state senate, holding up a picture of Jake and talking about how I almost killed his son through my reckless actions at the camp. He kept using words like accountability and protecting our children, while Linda stood next to him wiping her eyes, and I watched the whole thing from my apartment on the local news, feeling my stomach turn inside out. The reporters ate it up, asking him about his plans for child safety reform, and he pointed right at the camera saying people like me should never be allowed near kids again, that the state needed stricter background checks and oversight for anyone working with minors. By noon, his announcement video had 50,000 views and climbing, with comments calling me a monster who should rot in prison. Day 43 came, and I needed groceries, but walking through Pine felt like moving through a town where I'd died, but my ghost kept showing up anyway. At the grocery store, parents literally grabbed their kids' hands and pulled them away from me, and the cashier I'd known for 3 years wouldn't make eye contact while scanning my stuff. The local paper had my mugshot on the front page again, with a story about Linda's husband's campaign, using the same photo from my arrest, where I looked exhausted and guilty. My new lawyer called that afternoon saying she'd found something huge in the discovery documents, that the board members had been expecting $1 million donation from some tech company, but only if the camp completed its full summer season without any interruptions. She had emails between board members members discussing how much money they'd lose per day if they evacuated, calculating that potential lawsuits would cost less than losing the donation. Phillips had been following direct orders to keep the camp open no matter what, with one board member writing, "Weather events are temporary, but donors remember everything." 2 days later, Marcus's foster mom showed up at my door carrying a folder full of drawings he'd made about the fire. She spread them out on my kitchen table, and I saw he'd drawn detailed maps of the mine tunnels where they survived, with notes in his neat handwriting about finding water by listening for drips, the way I'd taught them during wilderness training. One drawing showed the 3 boys huddled together for warmth, using the buddy system we'd practiced. Another showed them marking their path with rocks, like I'd demonstrated on a nature hike. His foster mom said Marcus wanted me to know that everything I taught them saved their lives down there, that without those lessons, they would have died. The next morning, my lawyer called saying the other parents were filing a civil suit against me for emotional trauma from the unauthorized evacuation, claiming their kids had PTSD from being kidnapped and driven away from camp. She said defending against both criminal charges and a civil suit would drain every penny I had, and then some, that most people in my position would have already filed for bankruptcy. 3 days later, Jake's recording from the mine got leaked to some podcast about wilderness disasters, and within 4 hours, it had gone viral with 2 million plays. You could hear Jake's voice describing how I'd taught them to stay calm in emergencies, how my wilderness lessons kept them alive, how the real villain was Phillips for ignoring the evacuation order. His dad went on the news threatening to sue the podcast, the person who leaked it, and anyone who shared it, but the damage was already done because people were starting to question why I was being blamed for saving kids. Sarah came over that night with her laptop, and we watched the evacuation footage some parent had posted online. You could see Phillips standing in his office window, clearly visible, watching us load kids onto buses while he held his phone to his ear. The timestamp showed this was 20 minutes after the evacuation order, and he never once came outside to help or direct the evacuation he claimed later was chaotic and dangerous. We counted 12 minutes where he just stood there watching while counselors ran around trying to save kids, and Sarah screen recorded everything before it could disappear. 2 days later, I met with a trauma counselor the court had ordered me to see, and she was the first person in weeks who didn't look at me like I was guilty. She said my decision to evacuate had saved 197 lives, that the 3 boys survived specifically because of the survival skills I'd taught them, that survivor's guilt was common but misplaced in my situation. After our session, I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for 10 minutes because someone finally said I wasn't a monster. The next day, 2 more counselors from previous summers reached out to my lawyer with stories about Phillips making dangerous calls to keep the camp profitable. One had emails where Phillips literally wrote, "Parental revenue exceeds potential lawsuit costs," when she'd raised concerns about outdated equipment, and another had recordings of Phillips saying insurance would cover any injuries, so there was no need to cancel activities during severe weather warnings. My lawyer said this pattern went back his entire 15-year tenure, that the board had been enabling him the whole time because he kept the camp profitable. On day 53, the prosecutor called my lawyer with a new deal, saying they'd realized the board's liability was massive, and they needed witnesses who could testify about the culture of negligence. They wanted me to testify against the board members in exchange for dropping all charges against me, and my lawyer said it was my only realistic chance to avoid prison time. My lawyer said we needed all the evidence we could get, so I spent the next day calling everyone from camp, but Greg wasn't answering his phone at all. On day 54, Sarah called me crying because she'd heard Greg got served with his own lawsuit and nobody had seen him since. I drove out to what was left of the camp, and the whole place still smelled like burnt wood even after all these weeks. Greg's truck was parked near the old maintenance shed area, and I found him passed out in the driver's seat with an empty bottle of whiskey on the floor. His hands were clutching some papers that were all wet from where he'd been crying on them, and when I pulled them free, I saw they were meeting notes from 2 years ago. The board had actually discussed the fire danger and decided not to spend money on clearing brush or updating evacuation plans because insurance would cover any losses. I took photos of every page before calling Sarah to come help me get Greg to the hospital, and while we waited, he kept mumbling about how he should have said something sooner. Day 55 brought a surprise when Ethan's parents called a local news station and asked to do an interview, even though they'd been scared about their immigration status getting attention. Ethan's dad sat there on TV explaining how I'd taught Ethan to find water and stay put if he got lost, and that's exactly what saved his life in that cave. The reporter asked if they blamed me for what happened, and his mom just shook her head and said I was the only adult who cared more about kids than keeping my job. The story went viral online, and suddenly people were sharing it with headlines about the counselor who saved 200 kids. I couldn't watch anymore because it felt wrong getting credit when 3 boys almost died, so I drove out to see the memorial someone had put up for Phillips at the camp entrance. Phillips had a meeting about building character through smoke exposure the same morning kids were breathing actual fire smoke. That's some next-level bad timing for his sales pitch. The board members calculating lawsuit costs versus donation money like there. Someone had spray-painted child killer in red across his photo, and I just stood there feeling nothing but this hollow feeling in my chest. The local paper was calling him a hero who died trying to save camp property, but I knew the truth about those last minutes. 3 days later, on day 58, I was making dinner when someone knocked on my apartment door, and there was Jake with a huge backpack and his eyes all red from crying. He pushed past me and dumped the whole bag on my kitchen table, and out came printed emails, USB drives, and even a small recorder. He said he'd been recording his parents' conversations for weeks because he couldn't stand the lies anymore, and one recording had his mom admitting she knew I wasn't to blame. Jake kept saying we saved each other that day in the woods, and I had to turn away because this 14-year-old kid was being braver than most adults. We were going through the emails when Linda showed up with 2 police officers, screaming that I was kidnapping her son and she'd have me arrested. Jake stood up and told the officers he came here on his own because his parents were forcing him to lie about what happened. The cops looked really uncomfortable, especially when Jake played them a recording of his dad coaching him on what to say to investigators. They said they had to take Jake home since he was a minor, but one officer quietly told me to make copies of everything before they left. Day 60 was when everything started to shift because a group of parents whose kids survived held their own press conference outside the courthouse. One mom held up a picture of her daughter and said she'd rather have a kid with PTSD who's alive than a dead kid who followed protocol. Another dad said he'd looked up the evacuation timeline, and if we'd waited for official approval, the buses would have been driving through active flames. The state attorney general's office announced that same day they were opening an investigation into the camp board's finances. By day 63, they'd already found millions of dollars that should have gone to safety equipment and emergency training, but ended up in board members' personal accounts. Sarah called me that morning to say she'd gotten into law school, but was deferring for a year to help with my case and the civil suits. She said watching this whole mess showed her what kind of lawyer she wanted to be, someone who protects people who do the right thing. The prosecutor finally agreed to let me have supervised visits with Marcus, Ethan, and Jake as part of their therapy sessions. Seeing them alive in that hospital room made the nightmares a little better, the ones where I'm always 5 minutes too late to save them. Marcus barely talked, but he drew me a picture of the 3 of them in the cave with "thank you" written at the bottom. 2 days later, on day 65, Greg showed up at the law office completely sober and ready to give his deposition. He brought 3 boxes of maintenance records showing every single time Phillips denied requests for emergency equipment repairs and evacuation route clearing. Greg had documented 5 straight years of Phillips saying the camp couldn't afford basic safety updates while approving bonuses for board members. The prosecutor's team spent 6 hours going through everything, and Greg never wavered even when they asked about his drinking. The next morning, the board members showed up with separate lawyers instead of sharing one like they had been. The guy who ran the camp's finances pointed at the woman who handled donor relations and said she knew about the fire risks months before. She fired back that he was the one who told Phillips to ignore the fire marshal's warnings. Their third board member, some retired banker, started pulling out emails on his phone showing the other 2 discussing how to hide safety violations from state inspectors. Within 20 minutes, they were screaming at each other in the hallway while their lawyers tried to shut them up. My lawyer grabbed my arm and pulled me into a side room to watch through the window as they basically destroyed each other's defense. The finance guy admitted on camera that they all knew Phillips was dangerous, but kept him because he brought in donations. The woman said they had talked about evacuation plans, but decided it would hurt their reputation to practice them. The banker kept saying he was just following what the others told him to do. By noon, each of them had separate lawsuits filed against the other 2, and the liability numbers my lawyer showed me were hitting $40 million. 2 days later, I sat in my car outside the courthouse for 3 hours before I could make myself go inside. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even drink the coffee I bought. Tomorrow was the big hearing where Jake would testify, and my lawyer kept saying we'd be fine, but he also warned me that Jake's parents might claim I coached him or manipulated him somehow. I watched families walking into the courthouse for other cases and wondered if I'd be walking out in handcuffs. The security guard knocked on my window and told me the parking meter was expired, so I had to move my car and walk back through the cold morning air. Inside the courthouse, Marcus appeared on the video screen from his hospital room, still recovering from smoke damage to his lungs. He held up drawings he'd made of the shelter we built and explained every single step I taught them about finding water and staying warm. The prosecutor kept trying to make it sound like I was reckless for teaching survival skills, but Marcus shut him down by listing all the safety rules I made them follow. He showed the court his notebook where he'd written down everything I said about fire safety and emergency procedures. His mom was crying behind him as he explained how those exact skills kept them alive for 18 hours in a burning forest. The judge asked Marcus directly if he blamed me for what happened, and Marcus looked straight at the camera and said I was the only adult who actually tried to save everyone. After court that day, Jake's father cornered me in the parking garage while I was trying to get to my car. He looked around to make sure nobody was watching, then said he knew I saved his son's life and he was grateful. But then his face changed and he pulled out a paper from his jacket saying he'd drop the civil suit if I signed this NDA about him coaching Jake to lie about the timeline. He said it would save us both a lot of trouble and legal fees. I looked at the paper offering me a way out of a $10 million lawsuit, then handed it back unsigned. I told him the truth was more important than money, and his son deserved better than a father who'd make him lie in court. He grabbed my shoulder hard enough to leave bruises, but I pulled away and got in my car while he stood there holding that paper. The next morning, the camp's lawyer was cross-examining our fire expert when he accidentally said something about the board having override authority in emergencies. My lawyer jumped up so fast his chair fell over. He demanded to see the camp's bylaws, and after 30 minutes of arguing, the judge ordered them produced immediately. Right there in black and white, it said any board member could override the director's decisions during an emergency threatening camper safety. The camp's lawyer tried to take it back, but it was already in the official record. My lawyer immediately filed for dismissal of all charges, pointing out that 3 board members had the power to evacuate but chose not to. The prosecutor looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. 2 days passed before the judge called us back, and she spent an hour going through all the evidence while I sat there trying not to throw up from nerves. She kept asking the prosecutor why I was being charged when I successfully got 197 kids to safety and then risked my life to save the 3 who were missing. The prosecutor kept saying I had a duty of care that I violated by leaving those 3 behind initially. The judge pulled out the timeline and showed that I had less than 15 minutes to evacuate everyone before the fire hit the camp. She asked how anyone could have done a head count with that much chaos and smoke. Then Linda took the stand, and within 5 minutes she was sobbing so hard the bailiff brought her tissues. She admitted she'd been protecting her husband's reputation as a corporate lawyer by making Jake stick to the story that I abandoned them. Jake was sitting in the gallery and walked up to hold his mom's hand without anyone stopping him. He told her it was okay to tell the truth now, that Dad would understand. Linda looked at the judge and said she wanted to withdraw all statements blaming me, that her son had told her the real story weeks ago, but she was too scared to admit she'd been lying. Her husband stormed out of the courtroom, slamming the door so hard the bailiff followed him out. 2 days later, I got a call from Sarah saying the other counselors had started a GoFundMe for my legal defense that had already hit $50,000. Parents who had blamed me at first were now donating and leaving comments about how they'd been wrong. Even some of the board members' own friends were contributing and demanding justice for what really happened. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly my inbox was full of messages from former camp staff sharing their own stories about Phillips and the board ignoring safety concerns. A janitor from the board's office building reached out saying he had something important to show the court. He brought security footage from the morning of the fire showing all 3 board members in their conference room. They were toasting with champagne while looking at papers, and the audio picked up one of them saying they needed to keep the doors open no matter what to secure the donor commitment. Jake recording his own parents' conversations raises some interesting questions about what pushed a 14-year-old to take such drastic action against his own family. The timing of Linda's sudden appearance with police seems awfully convenient, especially when Jake just happens to have that recording ready. The timestamp showed this was 2 hours after the evacuation order had been issued for our area. The janitor also had footage of them watching the news about the fire and laughing about how Phillips would handle it. My lawyer got the footage admitted as evidence the next day, and you could hear people gasping in the gallery when they played it. 2 days later, the prosecutor stood up in court and said the state was dropping all charges against me effective immediately. He announced they were filing charges of criminally negligent homicide against all 3 board members instead. The courtroom exploded with parents and counselors clapping and cheering while the judge banged her gavel trying to get order. I sat there feeling nothing at first, like my brain couldn't process that it was actually over. Outside the courthouse, reporters shoved microphones in my face asking how it felt to be cleared, but I just walked past them feeling completely hollow inside. My lawyer kept patting my back and saying we'd won, but winning meant Phillips was dead. The camp was burned to the ground, and 3 kids had almost died in a cave because grown-ups cared more about money than their safety. I went back to my apartment and sat on my couch staring at the wall for hours, not answering texts from Sarah or my parents or anyone else who wanted to celebrate. 2 weeks later, Jake's dad showed up on the news announcing he was dropping out of the Senate race after someone leaked recordings of him telling Jake exactly what to say to investigators about the fire. The reporter played the audio where you could hear him coaching Jake to blame me for everything, to say I'd panicked and caused chaos, and Jake's voice getting smaller and smaller as he repeated the lies his dad wanted him to tell. Jake went on social media that same day and posted this long message thanking me for teaching him that telling the truth matters more than protecting powerful people, and his dad called me screaming that I'd destroyed his family and his career. Greg called me the next morning from a rehab facility where the other counselors had helped him check in, and he was crying so hard I could barely understand him. He kept saying that giving those boys the flashlights almost killed him with guilt, that he'd been drinking himself to death thinking about what could have happened, but knowing they survived because of those lights was the only reason he was trying to get better. I started getting emails and calls from camps all over the country wanting to hire someone who'd proven they'd put kids' safety first no matter what, which felt so backwards since I'd almost gone to prison for doing the basic right thing. 3 months passed before the board members' trial finally started, and their lawyers stood up arguing that they'd trusted Phillips completely, that they weren't fire experts and had relied on his decades of experience. The prosecutor pulled out email after email showing the board explicitly telling Phillips to avoid any evacuations that might trigger refund requests, to prioritize keeping parents happy over safety protocols, to remember that the camp's 100-year reputation was worth more than overreacting to every little forest fire warning. On the 5th day of the trial, one of the board members just broke down on the stand and started sobbing about how they all knew Phillips would never evacuate, how they'd picked him specifically because he was obsessed with the camp's image and would do anything to protect it. He named every single board member who'd been in meetings where they discussed how evacuations were bad for business, how they'd rather risk a lawsuit than lose their summer revenue, how they figured the fire department would force them out if it got really bad anyway. The insurance company settled with all the families for amounts they couldn't discuss, but word got around that it was millions per family, and the board members were getting sued personally for everything they owned. Their houses went up for sale, their businesses got boycotted, and 2 of them had to move out of state because people would scream at them in grocery stores about almost killing kids for money. Sarah drove me up to see what was left of the camp on a cold morning in October, and we walked through the blackened ruins where you could still smell the char in the air. The flagpole was still standing somehow, all twisted and bent, but still upright, and Sarah touched it and said it was like us, bent by what happened, but not broken. At the sentencing hearing, the judge let Jake, Ethan, and Marcus speak, and the whole courtroom went dead silent when when these three teenagers walked up to the microphone. Jake talked about trust, about how he'd trusted adults to keep him safe, and learned that some adults would rather let kids die than lose money, and how that knowledge had changed him forever. Ethan's voice shook as he described the terror of being trapped in that cave with the smoke coming in, thinking they were going to suffocate in the dark because nobody knew where they were. Marcus looked straight at the board members and told them he still had nightmares about the fire, that he woke up gasping for air, that he couldn't go camping with his family anymore because the smell of campfire made him panic. The judge took a long breath before reading the verdict, finding all three board members guilty of criminally negligent homicide for Phillips's death and child endangerment for every single camper at the camp. Two of them got 5 years in prison, and the oldest one got house arrest because of his health problems. And as the bailiffs put handcuffs on them, I realized that justice felt empty and necessary at the same time. Outside the courthouse, Linda was waiting by the steps with tears running down her face, and she grabbed my hands and started apologizing for blaming me when Jake first went missing. She told me she was starting a foundation for wilderness safety training and wanted me to help run it, saying I'd earned the right to prevent future tragedies after everything I'd done. 3 weeks later, the state actually passed something they called Phillips's Law, requiring all camps to have mandatory evacuation protocols and removing any financial incentives for keeping camps open during emergencies. It felt like a bitter legacy for a man who died protecting paperwork instead of people, but at least something good came from all that horror. The foundation offered me a full-time position training counselors in emergency response, and I took it because I knew my first lesson would always be the same. Your job is to protect children, not profits, not reputation, not tradition, just children, and nothing else matters when their safety is at stake. Before I moved for the new job, Jake, Ethan, and Marcus met me at a coffee shop to say goodbye, and they pulled out this compass they'd bought together. The engraving said, "Thank you for helping us find our way out," and I had to turn away so they wouldn't see me crying. Greg had gotten sober after the fire and became the caretaker of the memorial they built where the camp used to stand. He told me he needed to remember what happens when good people stay silent, and now he tends those grounds like it's an act of penance for not speaking up about Phillips sooner. Sarah called me the next week with news that she'd passed her LSATs with a near-perfect score and was going to law school to become a child advocacy attorney. We promised to stay in touch, both of us knowing we'd be bound forever. By that day, we chose children over orders and did what was right. Some nights, I still wake up counting to 200, making sure I didn't miss anyone, and the smoke damage to my lungs is permanent now. Every breath reminds me of that orange sky and the ash falling like snow while kids asked if we were going to die. The boys' parents invited me to their joint birthday party next month, and even though it'll be awkward, we're all trying to move forward from trauma that could have been prevented. If anyone had just listened to that evacuation alert instead of worrying about money and reputation, none of this would have happened. 2 months later at my new camp job, I ran my first evacuation drill without warning anyone it was coming. The director complained about lost activity time until I showed him the photos from Pine Ridge, the burned buses, the destroyed buildings, the memorial wall with Phillips's name on it. He approved monthly drills after that, no questions asked, and I made sure every counselor knew exactly where the spare keys were kept. Now I watch my new campers learning to build emergency shelters, and I think about Jake, Ethan, and Marcus using those same skills to survive in that cave. Every child I train carries forward the lesson from Pine Ridge about what really matters when danger comes. When someone tells you to ignore danger for convenience, reputation, or money, you save lives first and face the consequences later. The scar tissue in my lungs aches when I breathe deeply during training exercises, but I'm breathing, they're breathing, and 200 children went home to their families. That's what matters, not the job I lost, or the threats Phillips made, or the lawsuits that followed, just that those kids made it home alive because we chose their lives over everything else. Alright, time to close the book on this one. Appreciate you letting me play the snarky sidekick along the way. Stay clever out there, and subscribe for more content like this.